They tried to keep them apart, until love crossed the river. The flash flood came down the Rio Seco like God's own fury, turning the normally lazy creek into a churning beast of brown water and broken cottonwood branches. Elena Vasquez heard the roar from the kitchen where she was grinding corn, felt it in her bones before her mind understood what it meant. She dropped the stone pestle and ran. The McCready boy was trapped on a sandbar in the middle of the torrent, his horse nowhere to be seen, probably swept downstream or scrambled up the far bank to safety. Daniel McCready. She knew him by his father's broad shoulders and the stubborn set of his jaw, though she'd never spoken a word to him in all her 20 years. 3 generations of hatred flowed between their families like the river itself, deep and bitter and impossible to cross. Her grandfather had died with Patrick McCready's name on his lips, cursing the man who'd stolen their water rights through lawyers and lies. Her father still spat in the dust whenever he heard the McCready name, but hatred was a luxury Elena couldn't afford when she watched Daniel slip deeper into the rushing water. She kicked off her boots and plunged in. The current hit her like a fist, knocking the breath from her lungs and spinning her sideways. The water tasted of mud and distant storms, of cattle and sage, and the metallic tang of fear. She fought against it, swimming hard toward the sandbar where Daniel clung to a half-submerged mesquite root. "Don't be a fool," he shouted over the roar. "Let the river take me." Elena's answer was to grab his wrist and pull. He was heavier than she'd expected, solid muscle and bone, and for a moment they both went under. In the brown chaos beneath the surface, she felt his hand find hers, felt him stop fighting her and start fighting the water instead. They broke the surface together, gasping. The eastern bank looked impossibly far away, but it was McCready land, enemy territory. The western bank was closer, but it meant bringing him home to her father's ranch, to questions she couldn't answer and fury she couldn't deflect. The river chose for them. A surge caught them both and drove them toward the west, toward Vasquez land, toward complications that would outlast the flood by years. They crawled out onto the muddied bank like drowned cats, coughing up river water and struggling for breath. Elena's wet dress clung to her skin, heavy as shame. Daniel's shirt was torn, revealing a chest marked with old scars and new cuts from the rushing debris. "Why?" he asked when he could speak again. She wrung water from her hair and didn't look at him. "Because letting you die would have been a sin. Your father won't see it that way. My father isn't here." But even as she said it, Elena knew it wouldn't matter. News traveled fast in the valley, faster than floodwater, faster than good sense. By evening, every soul on both sides of the river would know that Elena Vasquez had saved Daniel McCready's life. By morning, the implications would be clear to everyone. She'd touched the enemy, saved him, brought him onto sacred ground where no McCready boot had trod in 30 years. Daniel struggled to his feet, water streaming from his clothes. He was younger than she'd thought, maybe 22, with eyes the color of winter sky and hands that looked more comfortable holding reins than guns. Not the monster her father's stories had painted, just a man who'd nearly drowned because the desert gave and took with equal cruelty. "I owe you a debt," he said formally. "You owe me nothing. My life." "That's not nothing." Elena finally looked at him directly, and something passed between them like lightning before thunder. Recognition, maybe, or the dangerous knowledge that enemies could be human after all. "Your life belongs to your family," she said. "Same as mine belongs to mine." "Does it?" Daniel's voice was quiet, thoughtful. "Or do we get to choose what belongs to us?" The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from a distant fire. Elena had no answer for it, no safe words that wouldn't lead to more dangerous questions. The flood was already receding, leaving behind the familiar landscape of hatred and hurt, But something had changed in the space of those desperate minutes in the water. Hoofbeats approached from the east, McCready riders, probably searching for their lost son. Elena stepped back, putting proper distance between them, but she could still feel the warmth of his hand in hers, the weight of him as she pulled him from the river's grip. "Go," she whispered, "before they see you here." Daniel nodded but didn't move. "Elena." The sound of her name in his voice made her heart skip like a stone on calm water. She'd never told him her name, but of course he'd know it. Enemies learned each other's names first, before they learned to hate. "Go," she repeated, but softer now, like a prayer instead of a command. He walked toward the approaching riders, his boots squelching in the mud. At the water's edge, he turned back once, and Elena saw something in his face that made her forget to breathe. The river ran between them, already dropping back to its normal lazy pace, but the damage was done. In saving his life, she'd awakened something that should have stayed buried beneath 3 generations of careful hatred. Behind her, she heard her own father's voice calling her name, urgent with worry and suspicion. The sound of it pulled her back to the world of feuds and boundaries, of loyalty that cut deeper than love. But her hand still tingled where Daniel McCready's had touched it, and the river sang a different song than it had that morning. The old crossing lay 3 miles downstream from both ranch houses, where the Rio Seco narrowed between limestone bluffs and ancient cottonwoods, cast shadows like prayers across the water. Elena's grandmother had told her stories of this place, how the Vasquez and McCready patriarchs had once met here to settle disputes with handshakes instead of bullets, before pride poisoned the well of their friendship. Now Elena stood on the western bank, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. 2 weeks had passed since the flood, 2 weeks of her father's suspicious glances and her mother's worried questions. 2 weeks of lying awake thinking about winter blue eyes and the weight of Daniel McCready's hand in hers. She shouldn't have come. Shouldn't have left the note tucked in the hollow oak where she'd seen him ride past each morning, checking his family's cattle. Shouldn't have suggested they meet where their grandfathers had once believed in peace. But the moon hung full overhead, turning the desert silver, and some hungers couldn't be fed with reason. Footsteps crunched on gravel across the water. Daniel emerged from the cottonwoods on the eastern bank, leading his horse by the reins. In the moonlight, he looked like something conjured from her midnight imaginings, tall, lean, moving with the careful grace of a man who'd learned to navigate dangerous ground. "You came," she called softly across the narrow channel. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Elena had hoped he would, feared he would, prayed he would. The contradiction of it made her dizzy, or maybe that was just the scent of night-blooming jasmine carried on the river breeze. Daniel waded into the shallow water, boots splashing softly against the current. The crossing was barely knee-deep here, safe enough for a man or a woman or the secrets they carried between them. When he reached her side of the bank, water dripping from his legs, Elena felt the world shift sideways. "Your father know you're here?" he asked. "Do you want him to?" Daniel's smile was rueful, touched with the kind of sadness that came from understanding impossible things. "Alejandro Vasquez would put a bullet in me just for breathing the same air as his daughter." "And your father?" "Would do the same to you." Daniel stepped closer, close enough that she could see the scar on his chin, silvered by moonlight. "We're playing with fire, Elena. Maybe fire's what we need." The words surprised her even as she spoke them. Maybe it's time something burned. They stood facing each other on the bank where their grandfathers had once believed in forgiveness, where the river sang its eternal song of water finding its way around obstacles. Elena felt the pull of him like gravity, like the moon tugging at tides she'd never understood. "Tell me about the feud," she whispered. "Tell me what really happened." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You know what happened. Your grandfather and mine had a disagreement about water rights. Lawyers got involved. Blood followed. That's the story our fathers tell. What's the truth? The silence stretched between them, filled with cricket song and the soft murmur of water over stones. Finally, Daniel sat on a fallen log, patting the space beside him. Elena hesitated, then joined him, careful to keep distance between their bodies, even as her heart yearned to close it. The truth, Daniel said, is that they were friends once. Real friends. Miguel Vasquez and Patrick McCready. Two young men trying to build something lasting in a land that forgave nothing. Elena had never heard her grandfather called by his first name in Daniel's voice. It sounded strange, human, like discovering that legends had once been flesh and blood. They made a pact, Daniel continued. Water rights would be shared equally between their families, no matter what the law said, no matter who held the papers. The river belonged to both of them, or neither. What changed? Daniel picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water. 3 hops before it sank into darkness. Drought. The worst in memory. The river ran so low you could walk across it without getting your ankles wet. Elena closed her eyes, imagining it. The Rio Seco reduced to a trickle, cattle dying of thirst, crops withering in fields that had once been green. Desperation had a way of making enemies of friends. My grandfather had the legal claim, Daniel said. The papers were in his name, bought and paid for. But Miguel begged him to remember their pact, to share what little water remained. And Patrick chose his family over his friend, diverted the river, built dams, left the Vasquez cattle to die. Daniel's voice carried 3 generations of guilt. Miguel challenged him to a duel, accused him of betrayal, theft, murder. Elena felt the old anger rise in her chest, the inherited rage that had been passed down like a family Bible. But beneath it, she sensed something else, the terrible weight of impossible choices. Who won? Nobody. Daniel turned to look at her, moonlight catching in his eyes. They both fired. Both missed, or maybe both aimed wide. But something died between them that day, something that never came back to life. A coyote called from the distant hills, lonely and wild. Elena thought of her grandfather, dead these 10 years, taking his side of the story to the grave. She thought of her father's hard face, whenever the McCready name was mentioned, the way his hand moved instinctively toward his gun. Do you think they ever regretted it? She asked. The anger, the waste of it all. I think they regretted it every day. Daniel's hand moved toward hers on the log, stopped just short of touching. I think that's why they held on to the hate so tight. Because admitting they'd been wrong would have meant admitting they'd wasted their lives on a lie. Elena looked down at their hands, almost touching, separated by inches that felt like miles. What about us? Are we going to waste our lives too? The question hung between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. Daniel's fingers crept closer to hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin without the touch itself. I don't know, he said honestly. All I know is that seeing you, talking to you, makes me remember what it feels like to hope for something better. Elena's heart swelled with dangerous joy. She turned her hand palm up, an invitation, a surrender. Daniel's fingers found hers, and the world exploded into sensation, warmth, connection, the electric thrill of skin against skin. They sat holding hands by the river where their grandfathers had once been friends, where the water still flowed despite all the dams and diversions humans had built to claim it. In the distance, church bells chimed midnight from both sides of the valley, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another that would bring new dangers, new choices, new reasons to regret or rejoice. But for now, in the silver light of a desert moon, love had crossed the river at last. Elena's father found her love letters at dawn, hidden beneath the loose floorboard where she'd kept her childhood treasures. Alejandro Vasquez stood in the doorway of her bedroom, like an avenging angel. Daniel's carefully penned words crumpled in his weathered fist, his face carved from desert stone. "Explain this." His voice was winter wind through canyon walls. Elena sat up in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. 3 weeks of secret meetings by the river, 3 weeks of stolen kisses and whispered promises, and now the reckoning had come with the morning light. "Papa, don't." He held up one of the letters, Daniel's handwriting stark against the cream-colored paper. "My dearest Elena, I count the hours until I can hold you again." Alejandro's voice turned endearment into a curse. "You've been meeting with him. The McCready boy." It wasn't a question. Elena lifted her chin, found courage she didn't know she possessed. "His name is Daniel." The slap came fast, sharp across her cheek. Elena tasted blood where her teeth cut her lip, but she didn't cry out. Wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "His name is betrayal." Alejandro stepped closer, looming over her like storm clouds over the desert. "His name is everything your grandfather died fighting against." "Grandfather died fighting over water and pride." Elena shot back. "Daniel wasn't even born when that happened." "The sins of the father passed to the son. Always." Alejandro tossed the letters on her quilt, scattered words of love, like ashes from a funeral pyre. "You will pack your things. Today. Your Aunt Rosa in Santa Fe has agreed to take you in until we can arrange a proper marriage." Elena's blood turned to ice water. "You can't send me away." "I can and I will. You're my daughter, mi sangre, and I won't watch you destroy yourself over a McCready." She thought of Daniel waiting at the crossing, watching for her signal light in the old oak tree. Thought of his hands in hers, his voice promising they'd find a way to bridge the hatred that divided their families. Thought of a future that suddenly felt as distant as the stars. "I love him." The words came out steady, clear as church bells across still water. Alejandro's face twisted with rage and something that might have been grief. "Love is a luxury we can't afford. Your brother Carlos understands this. Your sister Maria understood when she married the Herrera boy instead of following her foolish heart. Maria was miserable until the day she died in childbirth." Elena said quietly. "Is that the life you want for me? I want you alive. I want you safe. I want you to remember that you are a Vasquez, and we don't bow down to McCready's." Outside, Elena could hear her mother weeping in the kitchen, the sound muffled but unmistakable. Carmen Vasquez had been young once, had probably known what it meant to love someone your family forbade. Now she wept for her daughter's broken heart and kept her silence. "Pack," Alejandro repeated. "The stage leaves at noon." He turned to go, then stopped in the doorway. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of old wounds that had never healed. "Your grandfather loved someone once. Before your grandmother. A girl from across the river." Alejandro's shoulders sagged beneath the burden of family secrets. "Patrick McCready's sister. Sweet little thing named Catherine." Elena felt the world tilt sideways. What happened to her? "She died. Fever took her the winter before the drought, before the water war started. Miguel blamed Patrick for not getting her proper medicine, said he could have saved her if he'd tried harder." Alejandro's laugh was bitter as alkali water. Maybe the feud was never really about water at all. The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. Love had sparked the hatred between their families, not greed or pride, but the terrible weight of loss turned poisonous by grief. Her grandfather had loved a McCready girl, and when she died, he transformed that love into 3 generations of fury. "All the more reason," Alejandro said, reading her face. "Love between our families is cursed, Mija. It breeds nothing but sorrow. He left her alone with Daniel's letters scattered across her quilt like fallen leaves. Elena picked them up one by one, reread his promises of a future beyond the feud, his dreams of ranches united instead of divided. Such beautiful words, such impossible hopes. Through her window, she could see the Rio Seco winding through the valley, the ribbon of water that had brought her and Daniel together and would now tear them apart. The sun climbed higher, marking the passage of time toward the noon stage that would carry her away from everything she'd ever known. But noon was still hours away. Time enough for one last message, one final meeting at the crossing where their grandfathers had once believed in friendship. Time enough to say goodbye to the only man she'd ever loved, or time enough to choose him over everything else. Elena pulled on her riding clothes and climbed out her bedroom window, dropping to the dusty ground beside her father's prize rose bushes. The thorns caught at her dress, drawing blood, but she barely felt them. Her heart was already bleeding from deeper wounds. The horse she'd saddled in secret nickered softly as she approached, as if sensing the weight of the choice before them. East across the river to Daniel and exile from her family, or west to Santa Fe and a marriage bed that would feel like a grave. Behind her, the house stood silent in the morning light. Inside, her father waited with justified anger, and her mother wept with ancient understanding. Both paths led to heartbreak, but only one led to love. Elena swung into the saddle and turned her horse toward the river, toward the crossing where her grandfather had once loved a McCready girl and learned that some griefs outlive the people who carry them. The morning wind carried the scent of sage and distant storms, of change coming whether she chose it or not. The gunshot shattered the morning silence like breaking glass, echoing off the canyon walls where Elena and Daniel had planned to meet one last time. She pulled her horse to a skittering halt at the edge of the bluff overlooking the crossing, her heart seizing as she saw the scene below. Daniel lay motionless on the eastern bank, blood spreading dark across his white shirt. Standing over him, smoking rifle still in his hands, was her brother Carlos, sent by their father to ensure she boarded the noon stage alone. No! The scream tore from Elena's throat as she spurred her horse down the treacherous slope, stones scattering beneath its hooves like tears. Carlos looked up at her approach, his face grim with duty and something that might have been regret. He reached for his gun, Elena. I had no choice. She flung herself from the saddle before her horse had fully stopped, dropping to her knees beside Daniel's still form. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow, but the steady rise and fall of his chest meant life still flickered inside him. The bullet had taken him high in the shoulder, missing his heart by inches. Daniel! She pressed her hands against the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. His blood felt warm between her fingers, warm and precious as water in drought time. His eyes fluttered open, finding her face. Elena, you came. Of course I came. Tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally spilled over, falling onto his pale cheeks like rain on parched earth. I'll always come. More hoofbeats thundered from both directions, Vasquez riders from the west, McCready's from the east, drawn by the gunshot that had announced the end of their fragile peace. Elena looked up to see her father leading one group, Daniel's father Thomas leading the other, both men armed and furious, and ready to finish what their grandfathers had started. They converged on the crossing like opposing armies, horses dancing nervously in the shallow water, riders with hands on gun grips and murder in their eyes. The Rio Seco ran between them as it always had, but now it would run red before the sun climbed much higher. Get away from my son, Thomas McCready commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd never been denied. Elena looked up at him, a tall man with Daniel's eyes and his grandfather Patrick's stubborn jaw, and saw 3 generations of hatred carved into his weathered features. But beneath the rage, she glimpsed something else. Fear for his wounded boy. Love twisted into protective fury. "He's bleeding to death," she said simply. "Good." Alejandro Vasquez dismounted, his rifle trained on Daniel's prone form. "Saves me the trouble of finishing what Carlos started." "Papano." Elena spread herself across Daniel's body, her arms protecting him as much as her small frame could manage. "If you want to kill him, you'll have to kill me first." The standoff stretched taut as wire, fathers and sons and brothers all poised on the edge of violence that would echo through generations yet unborn. Elena felt Daniel's hand creep into hers, felt him trying to speak through lips that had gone white with pain. "My fault," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the river. "All my fault." "No," Elena said fiercely. "Love isn't a fault. Love is the only thing worth saving." Thomas McCready's rifle wavered slightly. "You don't know what you're talking about, girl. Love destroyed our families once before." "Love saved me," Elena shot back. "Your son saved me from a flood, saved me from a life of emptiness and arranged marriages and carrying hate I never earned." She looked around at the circle of armed men, saw her own death reflected in a dozen pairs of eyes, and found she wasn't afraid. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford when love hung in the balance. "My great-aunt Catherine," she said, speaking directly to Thomas. "Tell me about her." The older man's face went pale as desert sand. Behind him, she heard one of his riders curse softly in recognition of the name that had started it all. "She died," Thomas said roughly. "Fever took her. And my grandfather loved her, wanted to marry her." Elena felt Daniel's grip tighten on her hand, lending her strength. The feud wasn't about water, was it? It was about grief. About love that turned bitter when she died. "Miguel blamed me," Thomas admitted, his voice cracking like old leather. "Said I could have saved her, should have gotten her better medicine, should have taken her to the city doctors instead of trusting the local sawbones." "Could you have?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Thomas McCready, patriarch and tyrant, the man who'd built an empire on the bones of his friendship with Miguel Vasquez, looked suddenly old and fragile. "I don't know," he whispered. "God help me. I've wondered every day for 40 years, and I don't know." Elena felt the hatred that had sustained both families, wavering like heat shimmer over summer sand. In the silence that followed, she heard something she'd never heard before, the sound of old wounds trying to heal. "Catherine would have wanted better for us," she said. "For all of us." Alejandro's rifle dipped toward the ground. "Elena, you don't understand. I understand that 3 people are dead because of pride," she interrupted. "Catherine, grandfather Miguel, and my sister Maria, who died in a loveless marriage because you were too afraid to let her follow her heart." She looked at each man in turn, her father, her brother, Daniel's father and brothers, seeing them not as enemies or allies, but as men shaped by the same harsh land, the same impossible choices. "I won't be the 4th," she said quietly. "I won't die for your war." Daniel's eyes found hers, full of pain and love and desperate hope. "Elena," he breathed, "come with me. Leave this place. We'll go somewhere the river doesn't divide us." It was the choice she'd ridden here to make, the bridge she'd come to cross or burn. Elena looked at her father's face, saw 40 years of lonely grief written in every line, saw her brother Carlos, already hardening into the same bitter mold, saw the McCready men, poised on the edge of violence that would solve nothing and cost everything. The Rio Seco sang its ancient song between the banks, indifferent to human pain, eternal as love itself. Elena pressed Daniel's hand to her heart and made her choice. "The river doesn't divide us," she said, her voice carrying across the water like a promise. "It brought us together, and no amount of blood will ever wash that away." She helped Daniel to his feet, his good arm around her shoulders, his blood staining her dress like wedding flowers. Together, they walked to the center of the crossing, standing in the shallow water where their grandfathers had once shaken hands in friendship. Behind them, the two families watched in silence as love crossed the river one more time, carrying with it the hope that some wounds could heal, some feuds could end, some bridges could be built instead of burned. The sun climbed toward noon, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang the hour of grace.